This tutorial is part of our full-stack React Django DRF channels project, DJ Chat. You can watch this tutorial and many more from our YouTube course playlist, or the whole course, including access to additional resources from our Udemy course. The Udemy course link, which provides the best price for the course, is in the video description. Now that we've built the functionality, the basic functionality of the interceptor and our CRUD hook, the approach that we're using to actually return data from our API, we can now press ahead and start to create the different components that we're going to be utilizing within our application. So we can now start to go ahead and populate some of the parts of the templates that we have already built. Remember, we're going to start with, we're going to start with this left-hand component here. So in the preview, this is just going to show us a few of the different, it says popular servers. Now, we aren't actually going to be doing any filtering here in terms of what is the most popular, but it's just very much a placeholder where the popular servers are going to be placed. To actually implement this, we would need some sort of data to actually determine what is the most popular, which we don't have at the moment, but we can definitely create that in the future as and when you are to deploy the application and think about some of those different dynamics. But for now, we'll go ahead and just grab maybe 6 or 7 or 10 of the servers that we have in our database, and we're going to place them right here in this section here. Now, remember, what we're looking at here is very much the home of our server. The data's disappeared because I've turned off the server, apologies. But this is the home page. This is where we're going to have all the popular servers placed. Now remember, if you are logged in, that might show you something different. We might set that up, like I've said many times before, that might be set up for some other component. So we'd need to create some sort of some sort of code to identify the fact that the user's logged in. So as and when we get to that, we might change that. But for now, it's very much a placeholder where we're going to add some data so that it can be changed later. So hopefully now you're going to start to see how we can utilize our templates in a much more effective way. Now, remember what I've said previously, like the primary drawer and in fact the secondary drawer, we've created these templates so that we can then go ahead and actually add in whatever component we need based upon the current page. Now, this is the home page. So you'd imagine this template in here is going to be related to the popular servers. But eventually what we might do is we'll utilize this primary drawer on a different page. And inside of here, we might want to import different child components. So that was kind of the whole point here of creating these components, and hopefully we'll start to see that in action. So I just revert all that back. Nope, don't do that. There we go. So let's go ahead now and create a component for showing the popular or servers in a list. Okay, so saving a little bit of time, and because you're probably already familiar with much of this now, I've gone ahead and I've added the guts of this component. So we're building the popular channels components. You can see I've just built the basics for that, export default popular channels, and these are all the resources that we're going to need. So we're going to be creating a list from Material UI. So I brought in all the lists, list items, list buttons, list icons, list item text, and so on. We're going to be using boxes and typography. That's all from MUI material. So we are going to be utilizing the use CRUD hook. So this is what you can see here. We import that in, and we're going to be utilizing use effect. So we're going to be creating side effects of some sort here. We are going to be utilizing an approach where we're displaying icons in a particular way. So we are going to be utilizing from MUI, and I'll explain this later, the list item avatar. So we need those resources brought in. We are going to be utilizing the media URL from the config. That's because we're going to need to access the icons for particular channels that are going to be stored on DRF, on our backend API. So we're going to need to access those. And then we're going to be utilizing link from React Router DOM because we're going to be creating links. Right, so next up, something else that we're going to need here. Right, so yeah, let's do this now. Right, so what we're going to need to do is we are going to need to access the open state of the drawer. So whether the drawer is open or closed, we're going to need to be able to access that state. Now we need to remember that inside of the primary drawer here, we have created this state here, and that defines whether the drawer is open or not. Remember, what's stored here is true or false, depending on whether the drawer is open or not. So to pass that along, open up the primary drawer. We're going to need to make a few different changes here in order to pass this all along. So let's make sure we do exactly that. So first up then, let's go ahead and define a type. And that's going to be called child props. Okay, so that's going to equal open, which is going to be a Boolean, true or false. What we're also going to need to do here is remember the fact that we're going to pass in, or we're going to be utilizing child components. So this essentially means that we want to actually be able to utilize a component, another component, and integrate it within the primary drawer, and then be able to pass the props down to that child component. To try and better describe that, so in React, the term children components, refers to the components that are nested within other components. So what we want to do here in the primary drawer, this is going to be our template, and we're going to nest other components, and those components are children components. So we want to be able to nest this child component inside of the primary drawer. And remember, by doing this, we're making producing a flexible approach, in that we can add different components into this depending on the particular page, this being the home, but on other pages, we can add other components into this space. And that's how we're going to create this flexible approach with our template. Now, in this case, we are going to need to pass down, like I said, to the children, the use state here, the open use state. That's what we want to do. But we also want to specify the fact that we're going to be utilizing children components. So let's set up props equals children, and we're going to specify that as a React node. Now, in this instance here, we've defined React node. So this is a built-in TypeScript type that represents the valid JSX element that can be rendered as children in React components. So likelihood is that we're going to need to resolve that from React. So let's make sure we add that in. Okay. So we're also going to specify type child element. So this child element type represents a React component that has child props as its props. And it's created using the React element generic type. So let's go ahead and add that in. So here we're going to say type child element equals React.React element, and then we're going to specify child props. There we go. So now we can go ahead and start to make some changes. So primary drawer. Okay, that's going to then, we need to specify React.FC, and then props equals. So we now need to specify children. Okay, so now we need to specify the fact that we're going to be utilizing a children component or child component. So let's go back down here. Now we have a placeholder here where we just created a loop to output numbers on the screen. So now what we want to do here is actually add our child component. So what we're going to do now is iterate over each of the child components, make sure that they are valid, and then add the open prop. By that I mean we're going to pass down the open property, so whether open is true or false. Okay, right, so let's give this a go. So React children map. So let's pass in children as child. Okay, let's get this right. Okay, so we're going to return React dot is valid element. So we can check to see if they're valid elements. If they are, React dot clone element child as child element, and then we're going to pass in open, and then else child. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring in React from React. Okay, just looking in the code, you can see there's a typo there. That's all good. So that's pretty much it. And let's just check. There's still the error. We'll just ignore that for now still. Haven't used typography, so we can probably get rid of that for now. Don't forget the comma. Okay, so that just tidies that up. Right, so let's go back into popular channels here. Let's just add something there. Popular channels. And just add that in there so we know what we're working with. And now we can go ahead and in our home, let's go ahead now and add this child or children component. And we can see it in action. So we're going to import popular channels from our components folder there, primary drawer. And then we're going to add that now right here. So it's going to be popular channels. There we go. So now when we go back, you can now see we're outputting this component inside of our template. And hopefully now you can start to see how useful this would be in terms of reusability. Because if I were to now make a new page called server or whatever page and was to now utilize the primary drawer, obviously I can make any other component I wanted here and replace that with that component. So you can see how you can start to build a more flexible approach to building your application. Now that we have this ability of adding child components, let's move back into the popular channels and let's finish off this component. A quick recap, you can see that what we're trying to build here is we want to make sure that this right chevron is placed or fixed in the top right hand corner, and the word popular here, or the title that's relevant to this component, is at the top left hand corner. Let's start off by building a new element structure, a box, and this is going to house the popular word. So let's go ahead and add some styling to this. So it's going to have a height of, well, the height is derived from the fact that these components, you can see, for example, this explore bar here, that's going to be 50 pixels high. So we're just trying to make sure that the box, should we say, that the popular word is in is at the same height. I think that's the general idea with that, 50. And then we can have some padding. So this is just general padding, left, top, right, bottom, and left. So in every direction, padding of 2. And we're going to display this as flex. gives us options to work with other flex options. And then we'll align the items on center. That's going to need to be in doubles or singles. And then we go for flex. So flex 1, 1, 100%. Okay, so flex 1, 1, 100%. This is a shorthand method of setting the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So in this case, it specifies that the component should grow and shrink equally. So flex grow 1 and flex shrink 1. And then the initial size should be 100% of the available space. So that's going to be flex basis here, 100%. Sometimes it can be a good idea, if you're not too sure, just set the background color to give you a general idea of what's going on. Something that's easy to see, and then just take a look. And this is what we've got so far. Now, obviously, what we're trying to achieve here is this popular word up the top left-hand corner. So we may need to work with the button in order to achieve that. Now, let's just take a look at the current structure here. Okay, so things seem to be aligned on the right-hand side currently. Well, let's just add the actual text. So add a typography element here. Add a little bit of, we'll do that shortly. We'll add a little bit of styling, or we're going to need to do something. Because remember, what's happening here is that we want to hide this text when the sidebar is closed. So we'll do that shortly. So let's add some text there. Let's take a look. Okay, so we still got a problem here. Is on the right-hand side for some particular reason. Now, if we have a look at the structure again, it looks like here that the box is kind of the position. If I look at the bottom right-hand corner of my screen, it's got a position 151 on the right-hand side. So let's just take a look to see if we can resolve this problem. All right, so if you open up the primary drawer, what's happened here is we've added the component to be placed inside of the initial box. That's the component which is housing the icon, which is used as the button to open and close the drawer. So we just need to move it from there and then just drop it down. I think that's the problem with that. So let's just take a look, and now we have the desired effect. Okay, so you can see what's happening at the moment, just about, is that when we now open and close, you can see the text isn't being removed. So that was partly the reason why we needed to pass down the props to this component, so that we could perform different operations based upon whether the drawer was open or closed. Right, so back into here, what we're going to do here in the typography is we're going to set the display. So we're going to, when the drawer is closed, we're not going to display the text. That's pretty much what we're doing here. So let's go for that. So let's set display and then open, and we set it to block if the drawer is open, and then we go ahead and set it to none, the element to none, and that won't then display this element, show the text if the drawer is closed. So at the moment we aren't actually passing our prop data in. You can see at the top here we need to pass it in. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. Now before we do that, we're going to need to set up some props. So type props. Let's go ahead and set open to a Boolean. Okay, that's that done, and then we can pass in open. So what we've done here then is we have defined a TypeScript type props, which represents the prop types expected by the popular channels component. obviously we're passing in the open prop, which is being passed down by the primary draw component. Now we need to apply that to the function so we can define what properties can be passed into this function. So let's go ahead and do that. So first we can specify react.fc. This is a TypeScript type that stands for function component. It indicates that the component is a function that returns a JSX, JavaScript, XML elements, which are used to define the structure and content of the component's output. So here we're going to define props. That's what we've just created, which then obviously defines the type for open. So there we go. And that should be pretty much it now. So we're passing down the open state to our popular channels component. If the drawer is open, then open is true, in which case this block here, this component, will be shown. And then when the drawer closes, open then is false. Therefore, this block is none, display none, so it will be removed from the screen. So we can go back into our component, make sure you turned on the server, and you can now see the behavior. So we can get rid of this blue now. We don't need that. That was just for us to be able to identify the component on the screen while we're developing. And there we go. So that's the setup we now have. So that just leaves us now to grab some data from our API and display the popular servers, or what will be the popular servers here on the left-hand side. Okay, so let's think about creating first an interface. So defining the data that we're going to be working with and returning from the API. So interface, let's call this server. Let's go ahead and just think about the data we want to work with. So this should match the data that's being returned from the server. So ID, name, we may need to make some changes to make sure it matches. But category, and then icon. So that's going to be a string. Right, so with that in place, now we've already imported the hook, our custom hook, use CRUD. So that's already in place. So let's go ahead now and just make sure we bring in all the components of that. So we're going to be working with data CRUD. So that should be the data that's returned. Error, we might want to deal with that. I'm probably not going to work with that straight away, but that's something that we can work with. And loading and fetch data. That's the actual function which fetches the data, of course. And then that data is then placed into data CRUD. It can be placed in data CRUD, and that's where we can find it. Right, so that's going to equal use CRUD, and then we can specify our interface. It's the expected data that's being returned. Let's go ahead. And now we can pass in the actual endpoint for this. Right. Okay, so you might be wondering why we have these empty square brackets here used to identify an array, because let's remember useCRUD takes in two properties. That's the initial data and then the API URL that we're going to be utilizing. So we want the initial data to be empty, so we've just added an array here. Right, so assuming that you have the Django server turned on, and because I don't think we've turned it off just yet, let's just remind ourselves that we're going to need some data from our API. So we're going to need to pass over a request URL. Remember here, we're going to need to specify over here a URL. We'll pass in the API URL. Now, what we need to remember also is that that's not the full URL. Remember, we're creating the request from, first of all, the base URL, which is from the config. So that's always going to be our base. And then we just need to extend it with the additional string that's needed in order to create whatever it is that we need to build here. So how about we just go for server select? Right, so let's just get rid of cat 3 for now. Let's just execute that. So that should just be server and select. That's just going to return all the servers. Now, I can't remember how many servers we've got here. Looks like we've got 7 at the moment. So that should be enough to get started. So let's just go for that. Right, so let's go. I'm just copying server and select for now. I'll go back into the code here. And all we need to do at this point is add that in. So that's going to be /server/select. That's going to be in the doubles. There we go. So we're just passing that back over to our function here. That's going to be the API URL string. And then that's going to then be utilized here in line 21 to extend the get function here, the access get function, to actually get the data from our API. Cool. Right. So with that data in place, what we can do is we can initiate the fetch data function whenever we use this component. So we'll create a use effect here. So that's going to run, we're going to run the fetch data function whenever we load this component. We're just going to run it once. There we go. We can test this out straight away. Let's just console.log. Let's grab the data CRUD. Remember, that's where the data is going to be stored. If you follow the use CRUD here, remember what we're doing is we're sending the request to the server, and then we're going to get the response in data, and then we set data CRUD here to whatever the data is. And then, of course, we can now access that data through data CRUD, which we're passing in through to the component down here. So that's what we're returning. So that's how we're going to access the data that's returned. Right, so let's give that a go. If we were to go back into here and refresh, let's go into our console. Okay. Doesn't look like we're returning much there. Maybe not, maybe. Let's take a look at our server here. Okay, right. So the server's not turned on. So that's because I've got another server running. Just close that. So I'm just going to start the Django server up again. That will be helpful. Let's give that a go. Oh, okay. Looks like we've got a problem here. So request failed with status 403. Okay, we've got forbidden because we haven't changed that back. So if you remember, we were showing you an example and we added the permission which required users to be logged in to utilize this this view set. So I'm just going to remove that. That's from the Django server views. So I'm just going to remove that, and then hopefully now we can refresh and access the data. Right. So now we've got another problem. No route match URL. Oh, okay. So error handled by React Router. So we've got a problem there. Okay, because I'm in the wrong URL. That makes sense. There we go. Back there. Still doesn't look like it's working. Does look like we are actually requesting the data. So notice here in the Django terminal, it does look like we're sending a request because we're told here that it received a GET request for API server select. And now we do know that through our documentation here that server select should return. That's what it should return, all these different servers. Now, somewhere which is useful to look at if you are having these type of problems is if you go into, again, we're in Chrome here, we're in the console F12 if you're on Mac, FN key and F12. If you have a look at the network here and just refresh, you can see that these are all the requests that are being made by this page, and one of them is of course, the request to the API here. So we're returning the status code of 200, which means that the request is being handled, and we are receiving a response. So that's normally a good indication that things are okay. Referrer policy, strict origin when cross origin. So that's kind of referring to cause. That can be important to identify, but typically if there's cause problems, it will be shown in the console. But if we look down here, we can potentially take a look at or find any additional errors potentially that would affect the request or response from working correctly. I mean, it doesn't look like there's too much here that indicates a problem. So the reason why the data is not being shown here when we utilize console.log data CRUD is because in JavaScript, asynchronous operations like fetching data with Axios do not block the execution of subsequent code. This means that the console.log data CRUD statement will be executed before the fetch data function has completed and the data has been retrieved. That's the important reason. And something I wanted to point out, if you're wondering why that isn't working, that's something you need to always remember when working here with Axios. The fact that potentially we're working with asynchronous code, which means we're not blocking, which means that we're going to run that and then quickly run that afterwards. And then before the data is returned, we're trying to output the data. Obviously, it doesn't exist yet, potentially. Now, if we take a look at the code here in UseCRUD, what we are trying to do here is we are trying to send a request, and of course we are waiting the return of that information. As and when we retrieve a response, we're then going to run the rest of this code here, which one of them being, for example, setting the data there in the data CRUD use state. Now, if we go back into popular channels here, what we can do is we can monitor the data CRUD use state. So, for example, when it is updated, we can use useEffect to trigger a side effect or trigger running this code again. So what's happening here is we create a useEffect and we've passed in data CRUD here. So we're essentially just monitoring the changes, any changes in data CRUD. And of course, what's going to happen is that we're going to send a request and then data CRUD is going to be empty. The initial state up here is empty. And then of course, when we receive a response, we're going to set the data inside of this state. And of course, that's going to then update this state. So there's now data inside of data CRUD. Now, because there is a change there, we're kind of monitoring that change here, utilizing this useEffect. So when there is a change, when data does appear, this is going to be triggered again. And of course, then that's going to show the data, or at least that's what I'm hoping. So when we go back and refresh now, we can see that we have some data. Now, in actual fact, on refreshing our API here, we only have one server actually inserted into the database in actual fact. So we are only returning one server at the moment, but that is being returned. That's the data for that server. So we can now see the data being returned. Something else you might want to utilize, and we have added, is the is loading. So this can be utilized to create some sort of placeholder maybe, or some sort of indication that the data is loading. Now remember, in the use CRUD here, we have set it so set loading is true whenever we initiate fetching data. And of course, once we fetch that data, we set the set loading here to false, or if there's an error, we then also set loading to false. Now what we can do is just test that out. We can add a manual delay if we like, and just to test that out. So maybe just before. So this piece of code here, we don't need to add this in. I'll just show this in place, and you can copy it if you like it later. But let's add, for example, 10 seconds of delay. Oh, that's probably a bit too long. So let's go for a 5-second delay. Right, so we've added a delay there, which means we can test out is loading. So what I've done here is I've added console.log is loading. So we're going to watch is loading, watch it change as the data is returned. So what should happen here is we should start off with is loading to false. It should then change to true as we fetch the data. There should be a 5-second delay. After that 5 seconds, is loading should then be set back to false. And then of course it should show the data. So let's just give this a go. So it starts off false. Now it's true because we're loading. Now we're waiting 5 seconds. We're looking down here in the left-hand side. And you can see after 5 seconds, it's then set to false. And then we return the data. So is loading looks like it's working, which means we can utilize it to create some sort of placeholder to indicate to the user that the data is still loading. Should we have a situation where potentially data will take a few seconds to load. Okay, so hopefully you can start to see some of those mechanics that we've added, which we're not going to necessarily implement at this stage. So we'll just get rid of that use effect there. We don't need that. We are going to initiate fetching data, so we keep that in place. Right, so all we need to do now is list out or loop out a list of all the servers. All right, so this is where we need to add quite a substantial piece of code. So we're going to build a new list. Inside of that list, we're going to loop out our data CRUD data. So we're going to use map to do that. And then let's refer to item. And let's go ahead now and loop out all the data. So what we're doing here, we're taking all the data that's inside or being returned from the server, and we're just going to loop it out. And then we're going to refer to that data as item. So inside of that data, we should have, we'll not be able to see it now, we should have, if you're looking here, we should have ID, channels, server, name, description, owner, and category. So that's what's being returned from the server. So we'll be able to access that data. Right, so typically when we build a list, we're going to need some sort of keys. So each item would have a unique key, if you like. So let's set the, well, let's actually just finish that off. So let's set the key to, remember we referred to the data that we'll be looping through as item, and then the data inside of it, so ID. Remember we've got ID, channel, server, name, description, owner, and so on. So that would be the key for each item. Now remember, every time we loop around, that will have a different ID, so we have a different key for each item. So now it's a case of just adding some styling. So what I'm going to do here is disable the padding, so I can set that myself, should I like. Although what we need to remember here is that padding's probably already been set because we're adding, remember we created a template, a placeholder for this. So we want to potentially remove some of this information. So we can have display block. I'm not entirely sure if that's needed. What's happened is obviously I've written this code previously and I've made these styling changes, and I've probably forgotten reasons why I've done some of these. But so we're going to set dense equals true. Now this is a setting that is an MUI setting that you can normally define on most components. This just means that it's going to remove some of the line or padding between items in this case. So it's going to look like the items are more squeezed up together. Dense equals true. Right, so with that in place, we can now go ahead and, well, every item here is going to be a link. So the idea here is that we want to show all the servers. If we click on one of those servers, that's going to obviously take you to the server page, and you can start chatting within that particular server. So we're going to wrap this all up with the link tag here, and that means that we can, remember we've already imported all these resources in at the top, so we can now set up the actual link. That's going to be /server/ and then the item ID. So that's how we're going to set up the actual link to the server. So we're going to use the server ID, which is unique. Remember, that's the primary key of the server at the moment. We might want to change that in the future to something more substantial, but we're just going to be utilizing the primary key of the server table for now. Right, so that's going to be unique. With that in place, and we can add some styling. So notice this time I'm using style, not SX. Sometimes some styling can only be done through style. Always better done through styling. So text declaration none. So this is just going to remove the, because we're creating a link here that has some pre-created styling. And one of them is, for example, sometimes it comes with a blue underline, I think it is. So this is just going to remove some of the basic styling. So we're just going to set text declaration to none, and then set the color to inherit. And that's just going to take the color of the font that's the default color of the text, which is going to be like a black color. So now we have that in place. Now we're going to add, well, now we need to think about adding the other item. So before we do that, let's go ahead and just output something here. So the item name, so we can see this in action, item.name, so we can see where we are. So give that a go. Let's refresh. See, refresh. Oh dear. Okay. So it was there. Now it's been removed. Oh, apologies. We've still got the delay set, so that's why that's happening. So you can see the text is appearing there. So we just need to remove that delay. So we set that 5-second delay. Just get rid of that. That was confusing. And there we go. So we have now the server. So obviously we want to add some text above and below. So what you'll find with these lists is that we can define primary text, that's the text above, and below is the secondary text. So in actual fact, it's really easy to develop something like this because all the tools are available within. Now, in order to get this circle here, this is where we're going to be using list item avatar, and that's going to provide us the tools to kind of build this type of structure here. It would be worth reading through MUI to take a look at how that's done. MUI avatar. So that's going to take you to here. You can see that, and this talks a little bit more about how to build these avatar type of icons, and should then give you an idea of all the different things you can do with it. So we're just utilizing that because it's round and it's easy to utilize and just drop into where we need. Now, in addition to that, it's worth looking through the list here. This is going to give us an idea of potentially how to structure what we're trying to build here. So you can see from this structure, that's what we're trying to build, this right here, right? So we have an icon. Now, the reason why we're using the avatar icon is because it's by default, it's round, circular, and we can utilize it easily and quickly here. We don't need to. If we didn't want to, we could build our own kind of structure, but it just makes sense to utilize the tools that we already have in place. So you can see that there is potentially a way of doing that, although here you can see it's still using the avatar for this type of setup. And again, this is essentially what we're doing here, but we're using a dense setup, so there's going to be less space between each item. So in some respects, you can go crazy at this point and have a look at the different approaches here. You can see enable dense to learn a little bit more about that. What I find is that when you enable dense, it can make it easier for you to then further manipulate and change the styling. Okay, right. So let's just go ahead and get this done. Right, so we're going to start off with a list item. At this point, if you prefer, you may want to just quickly read through the documentation and just copy and paste the code from the example rather than following this, because quite a bit of code here, quite a lot of code here. So we're going to start with a list item button. We're going to set up some styling for this. So we're going to set the min height to 0. That's going to just help with the styling of this list item button, and then okay. So inside of here, we're going to set out a list item icon. So this is where we're going to place the icon. So list item icon. Okay, and we're going to set some styling here. So SX equals. So again, we're going to set the min width to 0. It's just going to help with controlling. And then we're going to justify the content to make sure the content's central. Okay. Okay, so inside of the list item icon, we're now going to create a list item avatar. There we go. Again, a little bit of styling for this. It's going to have a min width of 50. So here we're just defining really the size of the avatar, the image that we're going to now set. So inside of here, we're going to now, this is the actual image, so we're going to set an alt text That might be a little bit more dynamic in this, of course. We might set the alt text in the database and then display that. But for now, I'm just going to call this server icon. And then in addition to that, we need to also apply or provide some sort of link to the actual icon. So that eventually is going to be using backticks. That's going to be the media URL. So we're going to grab the media URL, which we've defined in our config, and then we just need to extend that to include the item. So the actual where it's being stored, the actual icon, that's going to come from the server, remember? So that's item.icon. So if we go back into the data, you can see what we're returning here. Well, we actually haven't set it up here. So that would just be the link to that icon that's currently being served from the Django API, well, from the Django service there. So that's the icon in place. So that will then display the icon. We don't need that, so it's just going to finish off with a slash. So that's the icon in place. So below the list item icon, next we want to now create the text. So the text is going to be list item text. Okay. In here, we're just going to supply a few things. So first of all, we're going to need the primary text. So that's the first line of text. So we're going to, in actual fact, what we can do is we can nest typography inside of it. So instead of just defining the word, normally this just will have the string, we can actually style it utilizing typography. So we're defining the variant. Remember the variant being the type of text predefined. So we'll go for a body 2. And then we can define some further styling. So let's go for font weight 700. So we're going to make it bold. We're going to set the line height. Now again, this is something that you can potentially, if this is styling that you're going to use again, you can set up a CSS file and set this in there. I'm just going to add it here. I don't think this is going to be copied too much in other places. Text overflow. Let's set that to ellipse. Sorry, I mean ellipsis. Let's just move that across. So we've got a little bit more space. And then I'll just put a comma there. There we go. There we go. Right. Okay, so what we're trying to do here then is we want to make sure that the text doesn't run or doesn't drop to the next line. We want to use these dots, for example. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the debugging den, blah, blah, blah. You can see it says w ... So the text doesn't move to the next line. You can see down here in the popular channels, syntax savvy beginners for, and then ... So that's the type of feature that we want to add here. That's what we're trying to include here. We want to make sure that the text doesn't drop to the next line, because if it does, that potentially then ruins the design or breaks the design in some places. So that's going to create a more consistent design. We know that it's always going to be the same height, for example. So we set the text overflow. So we're going to set the overflow to hidden, meaning that it's not going to show any text if it does stretch beyond the width. And then we need to set the white space to no wrap, so it doesn't move to a next line. So now we're ready to actually add in the typography there. Let's add the item name. So that's what's going to be shown there. So that should show us the top line, the code talkers, or the top line here. So now we need to do the secondary text, which is this bottom text here where it says code talkers, and then bottom it says programming. So behind the scenes, the actual CSS to place all that is already in place. So we don't need to do much here other than set out the secondary. So below the bracket after typography here, we're going to now define a secondary. This is the secondary text. And we'll do the same thing again we'll add in the typography, and then we go ahead and set the variant to body 2 again. That's obviously going to try and create a consistent, by utilizing these pre-built-in variants, trying to make things nice and consistent. So we're going to set the font weight. This time the font weight is going to be a little bit thinner, so 500. We'll set the line height, so we still control the spacing. So we're going to set the line height to 1.2, and then we're going to set the color then to text secondary. So that's going to create a built-in color, which is going to be a little bit lighter in color. And then we need to just make sure we do it right. And then we can define the text. So that's going to be item dot. This time it's going to be the category. So we're just going to add the category in there for now. It might be that you want to add something into the database where it displays a secondary line of text, which is related to the server. We're going to use the category. Now, something we might want to do is to hide the text, or think about hiding the text should the drawer be open or closed. So after typography, we have this curly bracer here. So after that, let's go ahead and add SX equals, and we can change the opacity. So let's set, for example, when it's open, we're set to 1, and then when it's closed, we're set to 0. So that's going to support the idea of just changing the opacity of the text so it's kind of shown and then faded away a bit if the drawer is closed. Although, of course, when the drawer is closed, we won't see the text anyway. Right, so we're just going to remove the list, this end tag, and we're just going to end it with a slash instead. Right, so that's that in place. So SX open, and now what we can do is set the primary typography props. Okay, let's do exactly that. So primary typography props. So here we're just going to define SX. I'm going to define text overflow. So here we're just trying to set up the text so it's all going to be hidden if it stretches beyond the width. So same principle again, overflow. We're going to set that to hidden, and then the white space, we'll set that to no wrap, so it doesn't wrap to the next line. There we go. Right, and there we go. You can see that everything is now in place like we would do here. Of course, we are missing some data. Now, let's go ahead and just make sure that this works. So I will add in this section's resources the images that I'm going to be utilizing here. So that will be available. So let's go ahead, and what we need to do, just make sure the Django server is turned on. Let's go into the server 127.0.1.8000 and then /admin, and then just log in. And what we should have here is the ability to, of course, add different icons. So we'll go ahead and do that now just to make sure that things appear. Now, all we want to do is, at this point, in actual fact, is just test the server icons. And that's just, oh, actually, it's not even available. Okay. So let's just make sure that's in place. Okay, so I have made not a massive error, but I have made an error. Maybe at that time you saw that in place, but I've accidentally added the banner and the icon to the channel and not the server. So it's not a big deal. All we need to do is just copy that across. So from banner down to the receiver here, I'm just going to cut that from the channel. So that's what channels should look like. I'm just going to now add it here into the server. Okay, so just need to make sure that you just tab that across correctly. There we go. I'll just drop that down so we can see the whole code. So that's what the server should now look like. Right, so now we've made those changes. In actual fact, we're going to need to have to restart the server. I think that's probably the best approach. And then we'll just add some more data in again. So let's go ahead and do that. Right, so here, what we need to do, and it's just a quick reminder also of how to reset everything. So first of all, we delete the database. This is how to reset everything. Now remember, what we need to do is to delete any migrations. And migrations will be found in the server and inside the account section. So just the initial file here, nothing else needs to be deleted. So that's completely reset now. The database for the Django side, the API side. So what we need to do here is just close the server, Control C, it does tell you there, Control C. Let's go ahead now and set this up again. So manage.py and then make migrations. Cool, so everything's fine. There shouldn't be any problems. We just copied and pasted it into a different place. Let's go for migrate. Something else we might want to do. Just make sure that the media, oh, that's fine. We could, yeah, let's delete that. So delete everything in media as well, we may as well. Right, so with that done, we've now created a new set of tables. Let's go ahead and manage.py and then create super user, admin, don't need an email address, admin, why? There we go. So manage.py, run server. Now at this point, I was going to go through a module or section of this course where I show you how to create, create data for your database fixtures. That's the one. But I didn't get to that point. And I think for now, at least, it's probably just easier to create it manually. So now with that in place, we can go back to the server. We need to refresh and log back in again. Okay, so let's log back in. Okay, so remember, because of the dependencies, we're going to need to set the category first. So let's actually build a category. So let's actually build a proper category now. So programming. Okay, programming. There we go. So how to do? So an icon. So here I'm going to add an icon for programming. Like I said, if you look in this section's resources, you will find all of these images that I'm using here. So we save that. That's programming. So let's go ahead and add a server now. So let's add an actual name for our server. Let's go back to our example here. So let's call this code talkers. So that doesn't work at the moment. Code talkers. So owner, category is going to be programming, description, yeah, that'll do. Members, need a member, and now we need a banner and an icon. So we're only going to display the icon. So I'm just going to, we'll upload just an icon for now. So go ahead and download that. Now do remember, if you do make your own icons, it needs to be a specific size. Remember, we set out that validation check in our database. So I'm going to use this demo2 PNG. So I'm going to save that. And you can see that we get this error. Good, right. So object must be instance of subtype of type. My apologies. Go back into the models. Now remember, this is the server model. So that's going to be in server and then models. I can already see what the problem is here. So in line 75, it already tells us where the problem is, line 75. You can see it says super category. And of course, we're not in category anymore, we're in server. So we need to change that to server. And in addition to that, this is what happens when you copy and paste stuff. So in addition to that, just checking this, you can see that it says def category and it says category there as well. So we need to make a few changes here. So that should say server, and then that should say server delete files in the receiver there. So just double checking everything else. So we've got server, and then server delete. And then we should have server.server there as well. So I believe those are changes. Now, I don't think we need to migrate at this point. We should be good to go. If you are having problems, remember, just check out the code base. You'll find it at the end of this section of the course. We should find it at the end, or maybe at the start of the course, there will be a section called resources. So just check out the code base if you are having problems. So hopefully now when I press save, there we go. Everything is fine. So if I go into Code Walkers, we've now applied this image. So it's currently using this image here. So we should be good there. So I'll refresh. And there we go. So the image is just green. That's what it should show. It's just a green image. You can change it whatever you like. But it looks like everything's working okay. Now, this category ID, I wasn't expecting that, was I? I think we should be having, or should be including the category name. So let's just check the code base for that. Right, it's getting a bit messy here. So I'm just going to drop that down. Going to close the models and the views. We don't need that. And use CRUD. Right, so we should be showing... Okay, it looks like we've got a problem here, potentially. We should be item.category. Okay, so we are trying to output the item category, and by default, that is showing us the ID. So let's go back into our model. So server models. Let's just double check what's happening here in the categories. So categories should be returning, for example, the name. Okay, so that's the default dunder return, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that should be what's displayed. So let's go back into our view here and have a look at the category. Right, so we are... Okay, so let's go actually into the serializer, apologies. Right. So maybe in the serializer, we need to define the fact we don't want the server ID. We actually want to return the server name. So what's happening here, maybe you can follow this, is when we create a server, remember there is a foreign key. So if I go into the models, there is a foreign key. So we have this category here. There's a foreign key over to the server. Now what's being stored in this server here is just the ID of the category. And we want to return the name. So by default, when we return the data from the server, we're returning this data, which is just the ID of the category. And of course, we want the name of the category. So inside of our serializer, we're just returning everything except for member. So that's just going to include the category ID. So to change the category ID into the category name, we can use the related string related field. Now we've already set the string related field here as the name. So that's returning in the category here, and by default, the actual name of the category. So we can utilize that type of principle to now return the category. So we're going to specify category here. That's the name of the field, and that's going to equal serializers dot string related field. And that's going to return then the actual name of the category rather than the ID. At least I hope it will. So refresh, and there we go. Right, so you can definitely go ahead and add some more data if you like to see that in action. You could utilize the filter to maybe limit the amount of servers that is returned there. That's something that you can definitely add and explore. So we're going to move across now to categories. We're going to use pretty much all the skills that we've learned so far to now add a component here in this secondary section, this secondary draw section here that we've already created the template for. So let's go ahead and do that. Just as a final point, if you haven't already done it yourself, I noticed that I did make a spelling mistake here at the end. So you just need to change it to an A. That removes that error. And now the popular channels file component is absolutely fine. There shouldn't be any errors inside of this. Nope. So all good to go. The only thing is that we haven't obviously used the error and is loading at this point, but I did show you an example of is loading. And then maybe a little bit later, further along in the project, we can take a look at actually implementing something for that in this component, both error and is loading.